Hi, my name is Jan van der Crabben. I'm here for Ancient History Encyclopedia, and today I'm talking with Wendy Orr, a rather prolific author of I don't know how many books, who has written this book, Swallow's Dance, which I would love to talk to you about because I think it's going to be of great interest to our readers and listeners here at Ancient History Encyclopedia. Could you tell me a little bit what the book is about and just, generally introduce it?
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure.
This is my copy. This is the Australian copy, and Jan held up the Canadian copy. Swallow's Dance takes place in the Aegean Bronze Age, and it starts really with the eruption on what's now Santorini, which was probably the greatest volcanic eruption that's ever in history. And I had started wondering about this about 30 years ago. And
oh wow, it's a long time.
Yes, look, I hesitate to say this because I feel like I'm quite a pragmatic writer, but it's not always true. And I actually dreamed about a priestess climbing a mountain, and with a sort of candle torchlight parade behind her procession. And I just started wondering about it. And now I don't think it was anything very accurate, but somehow it led me to start researching the Minoans. And this was just back when I really had just started writing. And I had a fantastic idea for this kind of feminist blockbuster adult novel, which actually got through to acquisitions in a couple of publishing houses. And then someone said, no, feminism is dead. We can't do a feminist novel now. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? 30 years ago, feminism was dead. And so I just dropped it. So the first book that I had was a children's book, and so I sort of kept on in children and teenage.
I had this feminist fiction that didn't happen, but I guess you came back to it with Swallow's Dance?
Yeah, so about 12 years ago, probably, I thought, well, that's sort of like 100,000 words that I'd written and rewritten a few times. Have a look at it. And I had a look at it, and I thought, oh, no, I really don't want to revisit this. This isn't like who I am as a writer. And I thought, but that world is, it had really pulled me in. And so I started playing with it. And eventually I wrote Dragonfly's Song, which ended up actually having nothing to do with that, with that sort of first premise of the volcano and all of that. And so after Dragonfly Song, I realized that I was really returning to that sort of story. And the problem is I never exactly know how my books are formed. They sort of start forming. And my original plan was that Leira, who was the protagonist, she was going to end up as a seal maker, the little Minoan seals, but they were tiny. You really need to stare at it to see what's on it. So they fascinate me. And so I started playing with this idea, and I can't remember. I think that I had actually started planning that she would become a refugee because there was, of course, nothing left of the island of Santorini. Well, the island is still there, but it was totally uninhabitable after. Yeah. So I started playing with that, and as I was writing, and while I was working on the first draft and the planning, the refugee crisis in Greece just really became enormous. And friends of mine actually went there with the UN with UNICEF while I was writing. And so, of course, that did bring it home. I don't think it actually changed what I wrote, but it changed the relevance for me.
Right.
And so I started playing with this girl, and I think the single thing that really made my girl start off as an upper class priestess class was a report that was going around on Facebook about this. You know, these people weren't really refugees because they had mobile phones.
Oh yeah, I've read of many things like that. Yes.
Yes, like, so obviously, if you have a mobile phone, well, you know, it's irrelevant that you've lost your home and your country and your family, you know, but you've got a mobile phone. And
yeah,
I
you
thought,
must be well off, right?
absolutely, because gosh, who could afford a cell phone? I mean, so I started really looking at that. And so I formed this girl who starts off as a sort of upper class girl. And the premise I've taken is that Minoan society was kind of caste society. And so I put her into the priest class. But then with the eruption, she gets off in time because in Theran they had, which is now Santorini, but there was a massive massive earthquake first.
Okay, yeah.
And now what they do, again, things vary. It was a season or a decade, you know, it depends which bit of research you read. But people cleared out, they had started actually cleaning, rebuilding, and then the volcano erupted.
Right, and that's kind of reflected in your book as well, isn't it? And that there's the first earthquake, and then there's the village kind of half collapses, and they're already refugees on their own island before the eruption happens, right?
Yes, and that's it. I mean, you can become a refugee in your own country. So I started thinking about this, and then I thought where she would go. And I took her to Crete, which was obviously their trading partner, if not more. But I wanted her to have a profession, which was obviously not going to be a priestess when you move into a foreign country, even if you start off as a sort of visitor rather than a refugee. Mm-hmm. So my original plan was she was going to be a seal maker because, as I say, these little seals, which are made of precious metals or clay, wide variety of things, different rocks, because obviously it depended, you know, how much money you had.
Yeah, definitely.
So I was lucky enough to actually get a grant from the Australia Council to go to Santorini and Crete to research it. Mm-hmm. And my plan was I was going to, you know, spend the time at the museum, and I would see a seal, and that seal would speak to me, and that's how I would create her. And I certainly spent wonderful hours at the museum in Heracleon, but I never found one that spoke to me. Okay. And what I did find was this wonderful archaeologist who I'd been writing to for some time, Dr. Sabina Beckman. And she invited me to spend time with her. And I spent one of the best days of my life with her. And we went to Gornia, which she had helped excavate. Yeah. And, you know, walked around. And at one point she said, "This is the potter's floor. And the sand there is soft. You know, it's all gravel everywhere we walked. And on this 4,000-year-old floor, there was still clay. Sort of, it was powdery. Yeah. And that was magical. So I'd already thought she was probably a potter. And a few days later, because when the things that Sabina couldn't do with me, she sort of, you know, plotted out where I should go. And she said, "Okay, you have to go to the peak shrine on Mount Yuctus." And so we climbed this mountain, well, big hill. And she said, because unfortunately they've actually built radio towers on the top of the peak shrine. Yeah. And so it's fenced off. And she said,
"But you see lots of those in Crete, don't you? Lots of towers on mountain peaks."
Yes. Well, I mean, I guess they're practical for radio towers, and I guess that would be the same place it was practical to have your peak shrine that you looked up at.
Yeah, before it was for talking to the gods, and now it's for talking to other people, right?
That's true, yes. So she told me that she had actually once found a seal stone up there just on the perimeter.
Okay.
And there's all this pottery just everywhere outside the perimeter fence.
Oh, wow.
And which was very exciting, you know, having gone to the sites with her, and she was, you know, a strict taskmaster. You know, she would pick up a bit of pot that's still on the ground in Gornia, or on another site that we went to which hadn't been excavated. And okay, now is this one early Minoan or middle Minoan? And about halfway down the hill, so totally legitimate to take it. It's totally out of context, just the middle of a hill on a path. So it's apparently part of a ceremonial pot. It's being fired, whereas most of the pieces you find haven't been fired. So it's glazed and fired, and the top of it told Sabina that it was probably a ceremonial vessel, and I can't quite remember why she knew that. Now, I showed her this little kind of line down it. So my husband and I, with our great knowledge, sort of that's definitely linear A of something. So I showed it to her, and she said, no, that's actually just sort of 4,000 years of being scratched down the mountain. So, but on the other part, there's a thumbprint.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, a thumbprint just gives you chills, doesn't it?
It does. It's not something that you would expect to find from somebody who lived 4,000 years ago, right?
No, but if you've made that little mistake and you've glazed your thumbprint in and it's still there, then it doesn't go away. And I said, oh, where? And I put my hand on it, and I could feel where that thumbprint was. I'm sure my thumb would be probably bigger than a Minoan potter's, but it seemed to just fit there.
Right.
Well, obviously my Leira had to become a potter then.
Yes. Basically, in order to do the research, you went to Crete and you got like a personal tour with an archaeologist of the sites with explanations and so on. That must have been an amazing experience and yeah, really open your eyes to that world, right?
Oh, it just is so totally different from reading. You know, I've spent 30 years on and off reading this background, and of course that's become so much easier when we were walking around Gornia and the site was totally deserted. And then all of a sudden this overwhelming scent of thyme. And so I've read about that, but to smell it and look up and sort of, you know, 100 meters away, there was a woman walking a dog, and the scent had alerted us before we saw her. That, again, that's that sort of little powerful thing that you can't quite imagine how it is.
Yeah.
So what was also interesting though was when I went to Akrotiri on Santorini, I wasn't able to speak to an archaeologist there, but when I went there, I was reading the sort of more common theory that because no skeletons had ever been found in the ruins of Akrotiri, everybody escaped.
Right.
And that is just not possible because they went off to the, I mean, what do people do? Actually, while I was still planning it, there was an earthquake in Italy. And I remember looking at these scenes of, again, people, refugees in their own country, camped in the hills. And I thought, people don't get on boats and leave the country. They go to the hills.
Especially with an earthquake, right? You're safe if you're not in a house. And I would also imagine that, you know, if there's an earthquake and the houses collapse, just just as nowadays, back then people would have also dug up the bodies and given them a proper burial, right? So it would make sense if you don't necessarily find skeletons inside the ruins, because, you know, if there were survivors, they would have probably been removed.
Yes, exactly. And as far as getting off in front of this volcano, Akrotiri probably had about 10,000 inhabitants.
Mm.
You know, that's a lot of people to get off in you know, small sailing ships. You know, if you had 30 rowers or something, these are not things that transport 10,000 people.
No, that's true.
And I think so somehow being actually on the island, which of course still looks so different when you go down to Akrotiri, because it had 200 feet of ash on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you were cutting down, and it's actually harder to visualize as a place where people lived, even though you're walking through this this excavation. But still, just being there and talking to this tour guide and hearing the theories, which I'd heard a little bit before. Nobody who was on that island survived. The poisonous gas actually would have killed ships out to sea when they've done comparisons of other similar ones.
Right.
And I actually found it so overwhelming. It took me 3 months to go back to the book. I couldn't just sort of say, oh, okay, we'll just change a few things here. The people become very real to you while you're writing, and just trying to assimilate this and the magnitude of her loss. Obviously, I had to get her off the island, or, you know, there's no story. But to think of your whole land just disappearing, it was huge. So the research, the on-the-ground research, actually almost made it harder for a while there.
I understand. Well, I have to say that this feeling of loss and despair and not just about, you know, what have I lost, but also how do I move forward from this, especially once she escapes and is a refugee in another land that also gets mostly destroyed, to be honest. I thought that was really powerfully put across how you wrote it in the book. So I can see how your experience there probably had a very strong influence on, trying to wrap your head around that.
Yes, it does. And of course, everything that really upsets you makes the book stronger.
Yeah.
It just makes it harder and longer to write.
Definitely. So one thing I was wondering, in the book, when it starts out, you describe in quite detail and vividly the two things that struck me that I thought were really interesting. And one is, first of all, you talk about the girls and basically the priest class collecting these crocuses for a ceremony of the Swallow clan. And I was wondering, where did you get the idea from of the crocus collection and the idea of a Swallow clan? So, you know, these different clans with names like that. I thought that was really interesting. And I was wondering to what extent, like, did you use historical background that you maybe found or read about or saw there? And to what extent did you take artistic liberty to tell a really interesting story, you know?
Well, that part actually I tried to make quite accurate. The crocus pickers or saffron gatherers is a really famous fresco, and it's actually not on display in the museum on Santorini, or well, none of them are on display in the actual excavation, of course, but it's famously photographed. And so it seems that definitely saffron had to have some ritual component. These girls were not saffron pickers in a sort of mass-produced market.
Okay,
And so, and some of the uses of saffron are for easing menstrual pain. So, you know, you could look at that. Does that mean it's part of initiation? And so that was how I played with that. And again, Sabina made sure that I had pictures of crocuses at different times. She was a wonderful photographer.
Mm-hmm.
And so she sent me pictures of the wild crocuses on Crete, which would be the same on Akrotiri, on
Right.
Santorini. And I actually tried to grow some, but our place just isn't amenable to crocuses. And I tried not to take that as a terrible omen that all my crocus bulbs were. But that part I really believe is probably a very simplified approximation to the truth. Mm-hmm. The swallows, there's a wonderful legend that swallows used to nest in Santorini, and the frescoes are full of swallow motifs.
Okay, yeah.
And so I think it might have even been quite a late draft. I changed them being the priest folk into being the swallow clan.
Okay.
And because these were, because the swallows were so highly represented, again, they obviously had ritual significance and or mythological significance, and so it seemed a nice name for the clan. Mm-hmm. I played around with it. There's no contemporary evidence for any swallows dance, but some of the frescoes definitely show dance. And when the book went to print, I got notification from Academia U about a new paper that might interest me, and it was about Minoan epiphany dances with using birds, sort of bird epiphanies. Okay. And I believe that swallows, I'm sure that swallows were mentioned there. I don't think I've made that part up. But it was one of those moments you thought, okay, I've made all this stuff up, and actually it's probably not far off.
That's great. That's really great.
It was really lovely when that happens.
Absolutely, I understand. And I mean, you go into a lot of detail as well on essentially the social organization of Akrotiri, and I was wondering, to what extent is that based on research, and to what extent did you have to fill in gaps?
Well, there's a lot of gaps, and with the Minoans, there is this kind of presumption that because it appears to have been quite a female-centric society, that everything was nice. I don't actually think that's true. Also, we don't really know that women were the leaders. It seems likely to me that it was a matrilineal society. If there's so much emphasis on women in all the frescoes and art, and you'd like to guess that it's a more equal society, but I don't think it was necessarily all flowers and dancing. Mm-hmm. And pretty well all the ancient world had slaves.
True, yeah.
It'd be very hard in those days to have the kind of really sophisticated, luxurious society that the upper classes had without having...
slavery and essentially some sort of empire building was essential to creating larger cities, larger entities, because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to support themselves.
No.
The agricultural output was not there for a city of a certain size to support itself.
No, exactly. And so I felt that they had to have a slave class.
As you said, you've been looking into this for, you've been fascinated with this period and time and place for such a long time now. What is it that fascinates you so much about the Bronze Age Aegean and particularly the Minoan civilization, I guess?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I think as a child, I read a lot of Rosemary Sutcliffe and then Mary Renault. And and as I was writing Dragonfly's Song, I actually didn't want to reread Mary Renault until I'd finished a few drafts. And then I could say, oh, gosh, I remembered a lot more of that, of the bull from the sea and the king must die. I remembered a lot more of them than I had consciously remembered.
Okay, yeah.
So, you know, they certainly influenced me. But, I mean, as a 12-year-old, I really believed I would grow up writing about Roman Britain. That was like Rosemary Sutcliffe's area, and that was, I really loved that. So I was kind of surprised that I ended up with the Minoans. And that's it. I don't really know how, except, as I say, this dream that wasn't very accurate that led me back to them, and then they fascinated me. And I think probably when I started, I was enticed by that sort of feminist image of, oh, the world would be lovely if women ruled. And then the more that I read and the more that I thought and reflected, and I guess grew, because believe it or not, I've grown older in the 30 years too.
Of course, yeah.
So I think, no, there's so much more to it than that. And
right.
So it just, and I think anything, once you become obsessed with one topic, then more and more comes in, doesn't it? So that you want to go on.
No, I have to say, for me, you know, I'm probably not the ideal target audience for your book, but I really enjoyed it. And when it starts out, it's more about the coming of age of this teenage girl, and I found it much harder to identify with that. But as soon as kind of the let's say real story starts, you know, I really got drawn in, because it suddenly becomes this thing that is actually very universal in terms of experience. You know, that anybody could have this experience, whether they are upper class or not, whether they're rich, priests, men, women, doesn't matter what age, you would still run through this same experience. And yeah, like you said, kind of lose everything. And also what I found was very interesting is end up in a society that doesn't necessarily want you.
No, because it's hard to be welcoming when the times are tough for you, because and in this case, I mean, Crete obviously had huge damage from the tsunami that followed the followed the earthquake, or the eruption. And also, actually, what I had first thought about before I realized that not so many people would have escaped is looking at how they reacted to a sort of flood of refugees. And but then when I was there, I decided that was just so much less likely. Then, of course, later I read more research that maybe more of them did get off in the advance waves. But it's in any times of hardship, whether it's real hardship like having your own towns wiped out by a tsunami, or just a more minor period of unemployment or something, then people turn against refugees because they're taking our jobs, or, you know, all those things. And so you could go somewhere as a visitor and be very welcomed, but if you turn up a few weeks later with no money and in desperate need, you might not be so welcome. And I mean, as you said, the history is very different worlds, but I don't think human nature has changed very much.
It's a really good book for anybody, really. I could also imagine this book being used in an educational setting. Could be read with a class and analyzed for literature, I think.
Well, I'm always keen on that. And I know that I know that certainly Dragonfly Song has been used, and I'm not sure. I think actually this one is probably an easier one to use than Dragonfly Song, so I'm not sure. But yes, of course, you know, all authors love books to be put on reading lists, because the bottom line is how we pay our own mortgages.
Obviously, yeah, I understand. But I think you also have another book in the works, don't you?
Oh yes, thank you. Well, Cuckoo's Flight is the same world. It actually, it follows on. It's not a direct sequel to Swallow's Dance, but it is a sequel in the sense that Leira is now a very, very old grandmother. And I didn't want her to be sort of really part of the story. And so I've made her an exceptionally old grandmother.
Okay.
And especially for those days. Although my guess is that if you survived childbearing and wars, you know, if you were lucky enough to live old, then some people must have lived to be, you know, into their 80s. You know, just because the average life expectancy was for Minoan women, I believe, was 32 or 36. If you survived all that, then obviously some people got very old. So it's just, but it uses the same world and the same town where I had been, and then starts off in quite a different story. But yeah, so Cuckoo's Flight, it introduces more of the Mycenaean wars, and who I've just kept as raiders. But it started because of reading a research article on a tomb that was discovered of a Minoan woman, so obviously highborn, probably, you know, a priestess or highborn woman, and there'd been a horse sacrificed for her tomb as well as a bull. So we know all about the bulls in Minoan society, and you know, think of the bull leaping,
of course, and
but not,
and so on.
Yes, but not so much the horses.
True.
So I started playing with the idea of, okay, when did horses really come into their own in Minoan society? Because it seemed to be one thing that was imported from the mainland. A lot of cultural things went from Crete to Mycenae or different parts of the mainland.
Yeah.
This one seems to have been the other way, and so I started playing with that. It's still in the sort of later aftermath of all the things that happened from the Santorini eruption, which, you know, caused the world's climate to alter for that period, and probably caused a lot of famine. And then, you know, it would take a while to rebuild all that the tsunamis washed away.
Yeah, definitely.
And so they were kind of ripe for places that hadn't been so badly affected to come in.
Cool. So your notebook is called, say it again,
Cuckoo's Flight.
Cuckoo's Flight. And can you tell us when it's going to be released?
March next year, so North America and Australia, New Zealand.
Okay.
Well, and then the Australian book always goes to the UK as well.
Okay. So, right. So Cuckoo's Flight, put it on our watch list.
Oh, thank you.
I'm looking forward to it. So great. Well, thank you so much for having taken the time to talk with us today. And yeah, it was really a pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you, Jan. It was really nice to meet you after a little while of corresponding and many years of reading your magazine.
Thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, it's been a pleasure to read your book, Swallow's Dance. It's really highly recommended. So if any of our viewers or readers are interested, head on over. We'll put a link in the description of this video or podcast. And yeah, so check it out.